In one of my darker moments of COVID lockdown earlier this spring, I spent hours scouring the internet, searching for the perfect yard sign that encapsulated how I felt about voting Biden for president. I was elated when I found this banner, which lists the guiding principles of Biden's campaign: compassion, faith, resiliency, empathy, kindness, humility, joy, respect, inclusion, dignity, and no malarkey. Considering the world we're living in, I thought it was refreshing to see a candidate that is driven by values. It's pretty important to me. In today's episode, Ben is going to give you more details on what Biden and Harris are all about.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Ramble, a series of videos about the upcoming election and why it makes moral and economic sense to vote for Joe Biden. In this episode, I want to talk about voting for Joe Biden. So what I want to do in this video is just talk about a few aspects of his character and to think about sort of who Joe Biden is as a person. I'll talk about Kamala Harris a little bit at the end. And then in a companion video, I'll talk about specific policies that Biden has proposed that conservatives might feel less comfortable with and why they're not super troubling to me. Now, importantly, I think lots of this video is sort of more my take on Joe Biden. It's hard to point to specific evidence on his moral character, but one of the things that I really love about Joe Biden is I think he's just genuinely a good person. This is just something that comes across when you watch him in interviews or in speeches. And for me, one of the first times this actually came out that I kind of first noticed this was actually in an interview he did with Stephen Colbert on The Late Show. This was way back in 2015. Now, I recognize that Colbert is far from unbiased, that this is TV, but importantly, when Joe Biden did this interview, he was not running for any office. He was coming up towards the end of his term as vice president. In the conversation with Colbert, they talk about loss. So Joe Biden had just lost his son, Beau, to brain cancer. And Colbert has, his father and three older brothers died when he was younger. And they just talk about what gets them through hard times and why, Biden talks about sort of why he works for our country. And what really struck me in the interview is how his religion plays a fundamental role in him wanting to get up in the morning and put one foot in front of the other when he's faced with tragedy and hard times, and how his family has supported him. And like I said, I recognize this is TV, but I think we should also recognize he wasn't really running for anything. And for me, when I watched that interview and many other interviews since then, what comes across is a person who's looking to do what's right. And so even when I don't agree fully with all of the policies he's proposed, I value that a lot. I value having someone in office who's trying to do the right thing, who is, who actually goes to Mass every Sunday and carries the rosary in his pocket. And not that I feel like the president has to be religious or Christian necessarily, but I do think the president has to have strong morals. And I think Joe Biden is striving to be that. He's not perfect. He's made mistakes, but he's striving to be a good person and promote good ideals in our country. So it's hard to point to specific evidence of that. It's more just a general feeling that I get, and I recognize that's kind of my opinion from watching him. Something where there is a little bit more evidence is Biden has a really strong commitment to doing bipartisan deals. One article that I read that I thought was really insightful pointed towards how, as vice president, one of the things that Obama relied on Biden to do was bring together support from both sides of the aisle for some of their policies. So, for example, in 2009, they were working hard to get a stimulus bill passed in the wake of the financial crisis. And the article talks about how Biden was just relentless in calling his independent and Republican friends in the Senate to find out what they wanted, what were they uncomfortable with in the bill, how could they find a compromise. And the interesting thing is that the article that I'll link below almost flags this as a negative because there's a lot of Democrats on the farther left that sort of are out for blood now. Like they basically want a Democratic president who will come in and employ a lot of the same tactics that Donald Trump has used on the right, sort of forcing things down the throat of Republicans. And Biden has stood up to them and will stand up to them as someone who demands bipartisan support and is looking for unity. The second thing I'll point to here is in his speech that he gave at the Democratic National Convention, he talks a lot about how, while he's a proud Democrat, he will be a president for all of Americans. And he says he will work as hard for people who didn't support him as people who did support him. And again, I just think this message of unity is exactly what our country needs. And the first step towards bridging gaps is having a president who will be an example of that, who has a strong history of that, and is looking to push that forward. The last thing that I'll point towards as far as who Joe Biden is he truly is a moderate Democrat. Importantly, I think a lot of moderate centrist Republicans have come out in favor of Joe Biden and have endorsed him for president. And this includes people like John Kasich, Colin Powell, Cindy McCain. There's a lot of others. One of them is Jeff Flake. One thing I really like that he said in his endorsement of Joe Biden, he says, "I've never voted for a Democrat for president, but I've been asked many times over the past 4 years if I, as a conservative, could vote for a Democrat for president. Sure has been my ready answer, if he or she were a Joe Biden kind of Democrat." And that, for me, I think really speaks to who Joe Biden is. He's someone who looks for bipartisan support. His platform is a Democratic platform with progressive ideas, but it's not a socialist platform, and he's so far from that. He very much has a history of being a moderate Democrat that looks to work across the aisle. Now, that's not to say that Biden is perfect. I think that he is a good guy who's trying to do what's right and unite our country. But I think a lot of times when people bring up Trump's moral character, and certainly I've heard this, that people will say, oh, well, Joe Biden isn't perfect either. And for sure, he's not perfect. And there are things that he's sort of said and done that make me cringe, I would say. But let me just talk really briefly about a few of the scandals that people point towards for Joe Biden. And my main point here really is, if we want to compare Donald Trump and Joe Biden, the magnitude and the quantity of moral failings of Donald Trump sort of are just so large compared to Joe Biden's scandals that it's the comparison is almost a comical one in my view. So I'm not going to give a lot of details here, but one of the scandals you hear the most about is the Hunter Biden Ukraine scandal. So the real quick basics of this are, while Joe Biden was president, he was charged with weeding out corruption in the Ukraine. And at the same time, his son, Hunter Biden, was on the board of a large gas company in the Ukraine. And people have said, well, maybe this compromised Joe Biden's position or his ability to carry out his role in the government. For me, the important thing here is this has been investigated lots of times. It was investigated while Biden was vice president. It was public and open knowledge and investigated very closely. And there was no evidence of any wrongdoing or that Hunter Biden's position influenced Joe Biden in any way. And then again, during Trump's impeachment trial, this was reinvestigated very, very closely. And again, no concrete evidence came out of any wrongdoing by Vice President Joe Biden. And this year, again, we've had more information come out, mostly promoted by the Trump campaign, trying to turn this into a scandal again. But they're just over and over, there's just sort of no actual evidence of any wrongdoing by Joe Biden in this. So I'll link to a Snopes article below that I think you can read if you want some good details about this. But for me, the main takeaway here is I don't think the optics are great. I don't think it's really fantastic that Hunter Biden was working for this company at the same time. But there's no actual evidence of wrongdoing by Joe Biden as a part of this scandal. The second thing that I hear a lot is when people bring up the pretty terrible and awful ways that Donald Trump has mistreated women over his life, people say, oh, well, Joe Biden has skeletons in his closet as well in the ways that he treats women. So I think those are serious allegations, and I spent a lot of time trying to read what information is out there. So Joe Biden does have one woman that has accused him of sexual assault. So I think it's important with this particular case that the woman who has accused him of sexual assault originally accused him only of putting his hands on her shoulders and neck. And then when he became the front runner for president, she switched her allegations to charges of sexual assault. And importantly in this case, there's no corroborating evidence of this. And a lot of the things that she has claimed and said actually don't stand up to scrutiny and have proven to be false. Several other women have also sort of complained that Joe Biden has invaded their personal space, that he has touched them on their shoulders or been a little bit more too touchy with them, more touchy than they're comfortable with. And Biden has admitted to this and says he'll try to do better. And again, I think this is sort of like not great, something that he could probably do better on. But comparing this to 26 different women who have accused Donald Trump of sexual assault, and several of those cases are actually in court with real evidence, the gap between the two is so massive that I don't think it's a fair comparison to say that Joe Biden also has skeletons in the closet. Now, some people have said that what they're worried about is like maybe Joe Biden is fine, but he's just a puppet for people that are farther left. And I kind of understand those concerns. For me personally, I find that hard to believe. And the reason for that is Joe Biden he's a long-term veteran politician. He has a pretty strong character. He's done a lot to sort of shape the Senate. And it doesn't really make sense to me that he would want to be just a figurehead type of president. It doesn't really jive with me. And like one example I'll give here is shortly after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, there were people that are farther left than him that were pushing him to endorse policies like basically a no holds barred, what can we do to prevent the confirmation of a new person to the Supreme Court? And Biden refused. He didn't cave into the pressure to do that. He instead has said that we need to have a return to bipartisanship, that we need to have respect for precedent, and that like we need to have a devotion to checks and balances, and what we do now is really important for what we might do in the future. And I think that's right, and I think that's a good example of him standing up to people that are farther left than him for what he believes in as being a president who will look to unite the country. So finally, this brings me to talking about Kamala Harris, his pick for vice president. Because people are worried that like maybe she'll influence him in some way, or given Biden's age, maybe she will even become the president for some short amount of time if he happens to pass away during his term. But who is Kamala Harris? I'll just mention a couple of things briefly about her. She has been a senator from California, and prior to that, she was the attorney general in California. And my basic take on her record is, as attorney general, she was very much a moderate Democrat. Most of the policy we see there is related to the criminal justice system. And she did some things there that actually people on the far left don't like very much. So, for example, she fought against a bill that provided early parole for prisoners. She drew a fairly hard line on drug usage. But then since when she became senator, she's sort of proven herself to be farther left than that, I would say, and more in favor of progressive policies. She's stated in the past some support for like Medicare for all or the Green New Deal, although that's not the platform that she and Joe Biden are running on now. So, I think she's definitely farther left than Joe Biden. I don't think she's as far left as some other prominent members of the Democratic Party. And in fact, there are definitely far left liberals that were not very excited that she was chosen as Joe Biden's vice presidential running mate. I think in terms of her past, she has a bit of a mixed record. I would view her overall as more of a centrist Democrat rather than a moderate Democrat. But I think also it's really important to note that she's very competent, that she's really sharp and smart. And I think she also buys into this idea of looking to unite the country and sort of being willing to do that. I think where she's farthest left are on issues related to race and equality and women's rights. And for me personally, that's where I tend to be a little bit farther left as well. And so they tend not to trouble me quite as much. And like in terms of like who she is, I think we can also kind of be pretty fairly summarized by a quote that I found by a man named Larry Cohen. He pegged her as a centrist Democrat who's shown willingness in the past to consider progressive ideas. So let me just wrap this up by reiterating my points that I think Joe Biden is a fundamentally good guy who's trying to do the best for our country, even if he's flawed. And I really love that he's running on a platform of unity and bipartisanship. And I think he really genuinely believes in that. And there are many instances of him being willing to stand up to those farther left than him and to not move too far to the left. And that's why I'm really happy to cast my vote for Joe Biden.